doing like a really quick introduction, and I'll just call out your name, and if you could just say, where you're at and maybe what cohort you're from, and just say hello to the group, and then whatever else you'd like to add. What are you noticing? What's going on with you today? So let's start with Bente.
Oh, hello. I didn't hear the first thing you're saying, but we're doing a short circle, right?
Yeah, just a really short circle, just saying hello.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Bente. I'm from Norway. I'm in practicum. Looking forward to this. Have been outside with my dog and thought about life and death while I was in the woods today. Included death in my web of interbeing, more or less. Thank you. Looking forward to you. Woo, love to see you.
All right, Elizabeth.
Hi, I hope you hear me.
We do.
I am from Austria, and I am from cohort 40 from Slovenia, so I'm also still in training. And I was confused if this meeting is taking place now or in an hour, but I'm glad it's now because I just placed myself on a very nice spot with a view over a lake quite far from here. And I'm noticing that I feel a little bit funny having this church right behind me. Yeah, but it's there and it's a nice spot.
Fabulous, thank you. Filippo.
I'm Filippo from Italy and from quarter 25 last year, trained in Slovenia. I'm at home now and so attending this meeting with you. So hope to have a good time. I'm sure I will.
Fabulous, thank you for coming. Christina. Oh, Christina is texting. She says, she's listening while working. So welcome, Christina. No worries. Don't have to stop working. All right, Giovanna.
Hi, I'm Giovanna from cohort 44. I'm in training right now. We came back from France. We were there in August, and I am from Chile. So it's 1 o'clock here from South America. So,
Fabulous.
And I'm noticing that the sun is just coming out after a wonderful rain we had this morning.
Beautiful. All right, welcome. Laura.
Hi, I'm from England and I'm cohort 42, so I'm still in training, and I'm really delighted to talk to some people because I've been doing lots of computer things, trying to work out, I don't know, when to do walks for the new year. So it's like, how exciting to be talking about magic.
Right on. All right, welcome. Lisa.
Hi everybody, I'm in the UK too, and I trained with Laura in cohort 42, and I've had a very similar day to Laura too. I've been really busy on the computer with deadlines and stuff, so it's just really nice to be getting back to foresty stuff, which is what I really want to be doing.
Right on. All right, Lisen.
Listen, hi.
Lisa. Hi.
Listen, hi. Great to see you all. I'm in cohort 36, so I'm still in training for another month. Very excited. And yeah, it's great to see the rest of you guys here. I've also had a computer day. My eyes feel square, and I have a pod meeting after this. So it's lots of forest.
Day.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank
Saya.
you.
Okay, hi, my name is Saya. I'm from Finland, cohort 22, if I remember right. And thanks for the WhatsApp group. Just 5 minutes ago, I realized we have this call, and I'm so happy to join.
All right, welcome. Therese. Teresa, you there?
Yeah. Hi, I'm from Norway and cohort 39. And I'm also working, so I might be a bit to and from maybe there won't be anyone coming into the shop, so I'll just but I'm probably not gonna join very much talking. I'll just listen in. Okay?
No worries. Welcome. And Veronica.
Hello. My name is Veronica and I'm from Czech Republic, from Prague actually. I did cohort 44 with Giovanna. Hi, Giovanna. In France. So basically, this is the end of my first month of practicum. And I just came from the forest. I was just mushroom hunting and exploring the new parts of a forest close to where my parents live. And it was wonderful. So yeah, now I'm back inside. It feels kind of funny, but I'm happy to join this call.
Fantastic. Is there anyone that is on the call that I didn't mention? Sometimes the names kind of rearrange themselves, so it's hard to keep track. No? All right. Well, hey, I have to update this because it's not July 2018. I added some notes from a presentation I did last year, so this is including some new stuff that we can get into. What month is it? It's October. All right, can everyone see my shared screen? Yeah, all right. And maybe if I do like this. Okay, is that better? Or is it the same? All right, cool, thumbs up.
Perfect.
And before I start, just welcome everyone. My name is Ben Page. I'm the Director of Training for the Association. I know some of you, and I look forward to meeting more of you hopefully next year. And if anyone is asking you about European trainings next year, we have a training in Norway, we have a training in Finland, we have a training in Germany, and then we're also working on adding trainings in the UK, in the Czech Republic, and possibly in the Netherlands as well. So if when you're guiding people and they say to you, oh my God, how did you get into this? I'd love to learn more. You can let them know that we're going to be coming back to Europe next year with a bunch of trainings. So today we're talking about liminality. So to start, just a brief definition about what liminality is. So those of you that have studied anthropology might be familiar with liminality as the quality of ambiguity and disorientation that characterizes the middle steps in rites of passage when ritual participants are between two social definitions. This mostly comes from research from the early 20th century about cultures all around the world that did rites of passage work, and noticing how in many rites of passage you're between being, for instance, a child and an adult, and they send you out onto some sort of liminal experience that you're not one or the other, you're in between and you're finding yourself, which then led into another definition from Jungian psychology, where liminality refers to the setting of individuation, where the individual withdraws from normative socialization, and we see the breakdown of the persona or the social mask. So I like to start with these definitions because I think both of these are really applicable to forest therapy. In the first, the anthropological sense, we see that when people get into the middle of the walk, there is a sort of disorientation that happens where things can be a little bit magical. I heard someone use that word today, magic. Things can happen that seem kind of out of the ordinary, and that quality of ambiguity and disorientation, I think, is really important for cultivating relationships between people in the more than human world. Mostly because the dominant mythology of our society says that those relationships are not actually possible in the way that most forest therapy guides think that they are, right? And then from the Jungian approach, thinking about this word individuation, we're going to come back to this word a few times, but I think this is really talking about what we describe as medicine. That each of us carries within us the seeds of our particular medicine. And I personally, from my philosophical standpoint, I think this is really about knowing and finding ourselves. This also laces into the importance of Way of the Guide, that we're not trying to tell people who they are. We're trying to help construct a container in which they can find themselves, free from prescriptivism and the way of teaching people who they could be or who they should be. And this is part of the disorientation and ambiguity also, because we tend to generally be used to settings in our world, mostly coming from oftentimes our parenting and our education, where the idea is someone is telling you who to be, or what you should be, or what you could be. And so it is a little bit disorienting when you have to be self-directed in your own process of actualization. So I have to shift my screen a little bit here. So aspects of liminality: not knowing what's coming next, not knowing what to do, ignorance of social rules and customs, a lack of social hierarchy. We pay attention because we need to. Experience as fluid and highly symbolic. We must self-direct ourselves. And I like to ask this question. Owen, if you're not muted, maybe you could mute yourself so that we're not getting background noise. Thank you. Did anyone ever play in the woods without adults when you were a child? I know for me, that was a really big part of my childhood. And I think this is kind of, it speaks to all these qualities of liminality when we're out there. And, you know, adults, I think, tend to have an ingrained bias that we should be telling children what to do basically all the time. And this is also, it's cultural, but I think it's also very bound to our current paradigm of the way we think about relationships between adults and children. I know for many of you, you probably grew up with this kind of a system where adults weren't really checking on you constantly. And there's this new term, helicopter parenting. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, where parents basically are always watching and always directing children. So if you remember playing in the woods, you might remember having to make up your own games. You have to self-direct. You probably remember having to pay attention because if you get hurt, you're gonna have to deal with that, you know? I remember when I was in Norway doing the training with cohort 39, someone said to me, you know, it's almost ridiculous for someone to say to an adult in Norway, you should be careful about getting poked in the eye with a branch, because in Norway, we assume that you know how to be outside and you're not going to need that level of supervision. Was that you, Teresa? Yeah. So this thing about we have to pay attention because we need to is a really important aspect of being within liminality. This thing about a lack of social hierarchy, again, speaks to the relationship between adults and children. When we're guiding a forest therapy walk, of course, we're not an authority figure. We're not controlling people's experience. So even within the context of forest therapy, like when you have a group of children playing in the woods, no one is controlling the environment. No one is controlling the dynamic. There's a certain ignorance of social rules and customs, of course, because when you don't have a social hierarchy, you don't really know how to relate to people outside of a traditional social culture, which is more or less always hierarchical to some degree. And then, of course, you don't always know what to do, and you don't know what's coming next, because who knows what's around the next bend or behind that tree. So I think in some ways, liminality is kind of a return to our childlike state, when we are in that childlike state without the coercion of an authority figure like a parent or a teacher. So a practical example about liminality, I often invite people to imagine your first days of college or university, or the first days of summer camp, or the first days of some period of time where you had absolutely no idea what's going on. What was that like? I know for me, when I went to college, we had what was called a freshman week. And all the freshmen came a week before all the upperclassmen, and we got an orientation to the college. So that was an interesting time. One, we weren't high school students anymore, but we weren't really college students either, because college hadn't really started, but high school had definitely ended. So we were kind of in between these two social definitions. And then also, I experienced, like I think many people when they go to college for the first time, that you're kind of liberated from the community that you grew up in. And so you don't really need to be yourself. You know, you don't exist within a cultural paradigm where people know you and have expectations about who you are and how you operate. So in this way, these liminal periods become an important place for defining ourselves and finding ourselves. And this is just another way of saying seeking our medicine. And it's kind of an experimental process with our own persona or our social mask and our own ego development. Right, so I think I just said this, but the college example is nice because we're satisfying both of these definitions, the anthropological being in between two social levels and the moment of individuation where you don't actually have to be you. I think this thing about not having to be you is so interesting. I recently went to something called Burning Man. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. It's like this, it's this thing where 80,000 people go out to the desert in Nevada and they build a city. And it's basically this participatory community where there's no money and there's no social custom, and you just kind of are there with this community of people. And it's interesting because a lot of people that I talked to said to me, I feel like here I can be myself. And I said, you know, that's interesting to me because I actually think what's happening here is that you don't have to be anyone, that you can be liberated from the construct of self for long enough that you can find a new incarnation of yourself. And Burning Man, of course, is a hyperliminal experience because you're in the middle of the desert and you can't leave, and there's no stores and there's no government, there's nothing but this community of people. And one of the principles of Burning Man is this idea of radical self-expression, that you can be whoever you want to be in that place. And I think forest therapy has an aspect of that too, where when we're connecting deeply to nature, like my feeling is when I'm in the presence of a tree, the tree does not perceive me as a list of constructs like my gender, my nationality, my profession, my upbringing, my education. The tree does not relate to me with those social constructs. It relates to me in kind of a more like essential way that I'm human. I am life, I am a being. And that I don't need to necessarily be Ben Page in that moment. I can be kind of the core of myself, which is in some ways kind of impersonal. It's just this beingness or this awakeness or an aliveness. And that's what's connecting me to the tree, not my education or my job or my relationships outside in the world. So that quality of just beingness is also a characteristic of this liminal state. So in forest therapy, the association's definition of the individual takes on elements of both the psychological and the anthropological definitions. So we say liminality is a time and a place where the dominant stories of the culture and the individual are temporarily suspended. Like I said, we don't necessarily need to be ourselves. We don't need to be anyone at all. We can be just this beingness, this core. In this state, people experience the world in ways they do not normally. This state is achieved through slowing down, shifting attention to embodiment and emplacement, and the thresholding process held by the guide. And this is also related to how we say nature connection and culture repair are related to each other. Because when these dominant stories are lifted, both in the individual context, but also in the social context, it creates space for new stories to emerge. When I let go of needing to be Ben Page, then I can experience myself in new, organic, and dynamic ways that can shed light on my process of individuation. It's like it releases the pressure of the stories that I carry with me so that there's space, and in that space I can find new aspects of myself. This is also true in a wider cultural sense, that when we lift the pressure of having to agree about what reality means and about what relationship to reality means, it creates that sense of spaciousness where new stories can emerge. So thinking about some of the dominant stories we tend to carry around with us, you are probably all familiar with these. Nature is not sentient, it is mechanical and controllable. Thank you, Mr. Descartes. Humans are separate from nature. Again, thank you, Mr. Descartes. Life is defined by the search for meaning. Thought and labor constitute a pathway towards meaning. The world as we individually perceive it is objectively real. Life is preferable to death. Time is the constraint against which we strive for meaning. This one I think is actually very interesting. I was guiding a walk yesterday and the theme of time kept coming up. During What's in Motion, a lot of people were saying something about movement is just time. And without movement, there would be no time. But the time doesn't mean anything. It's embedded within this present moment. It's just the movement of all things. It has nothing to do with progress. It's just movement. All things are separate and discrete. In other words, they are not interconnected. I am me and only me. I have an essential self. This also descending from the Western philosophical tradition, a very interesting contrast from Eastern philosophy, right? And as we get into more advancements in neuroscience, we're starting to understand that the brain that houses our concept or our perception of reality and of ourselves, we don't really have anything that is unmovable or unshiftable. The human that you were when you were 5 years old is a completely different person than the human you are today. And so many more. Does anyone want to add anything to this list? Dominant stories about the self or the culture that they notice might be temporarily suspended while in liminality? Okay, cool, or not. So why is liminality important in the context of forest therapy? So we say the forest is the therapist. Liminality, as we define it in forest therapy, is the state in which participants can make genuine connections with the more than human world. Liminality and its disorienting impact comes about through a process of slowing down, whim, what's in motion, and shifting attention to embodiment and emplacement, which we achieve through pop and the introduction. In some ways, we want people to be a little bit disoriented, not so much that we throw them into, a kind of radical disorientation where they can't, really exist anymore, but we want to shift them slightly outside of what their normal perception of reality is. This is how the standard sequence effectively constructs a container of liminality, by helping people slow down and shift from cognitive process to embodiment process, because this is not how most people normally operate. And I think we all can understand how the pace of life continues to increase, and the trend of perceiving through a primarily cognitive process, and a cognitive process that excludes our imagination, creates kind of a dangerous psychological milieu for humans to exist in. I'm going to talk a little more about the imaginal later in this presentation, but there's this wonderful book, I have it around here somewhere, that I just read. It's called The Lost Knowledge of Imagination. And it's a fascinating read. It's by a man named Gary Lockman. And Lachman argues that basically human beings for all of time have had parallel processes for perceiving reality. One is what we could call the scientific method, that it's a rational and logical approach to understanding reality. And this way of perceiving is very useful for the quantifiable aspects of our reality. For instance, if you want to build a house, you need this. But then Lachman says there are unquantifiable aspects of reality that we need the imagination to interface with. These things include love and freedom and joy and mystery, and that if we don't have a healthy imagination, then we will not have a very meaningful existence, because it strips all of these pieces away from our conscious experience. And Lachman, I think, very convincingly talks about how since the Enlightenment period, there has been a covert war against the imagination, whereby people have said, the imagination is not real. Anything that is not measurable is not real. This is called scientism. It's basically a dogmatic approach to reality where if something is not quantifiable, it can't be real. And I go to a lot of conferences and I present about forest therapy. I was recently at this one in Costa Rica, and it was funny because I was the only person presenting without slides that had graphs and charts and numbers on it. And I asked the audience, how do you measure love? Can you explain to me logically how you fall in love? Can you show me the order of operations that love takes? And can you show me how you measure it? And you know, people say, well, we haven't figured that out yet. And I say, it's not meant to be figured out. It's not something that you should be trying to figure out. It's something that is essential for our beingness, that you are trying to dissect and take it apart. It's not meant to be taken apart. It's meant to just be lived. So the forest is the therapist, right? Once participants enter liminality, something important begins to happen. They begin to have experiences through the immediacy of the body that begins to shift their mental patterns. From my own experience guiding, I would characterize these in three distinct categories: the imaginal, the mirror, and the intuitive. This stuff is actually going to be part of the 2020 revision for the guide manual, where I've been thinking a lot about the palette of senses that we use and that we teach in the training. And I think we can actually streamline this into a more kind of succinct and understandable philosophy about kind of the senses beyond the common Aristotelian five. So let's talk about these a little bit. So the imaginal. First, it's important to understand, and if you're interested in this, I highly suggest Gary Lachman's book, but he says, let's not confuse the imaginal and the imaginary. If the imaginary is our capacity to create fantasies, then the imaginal is our capacity to perceive unmeasurable aspects of our reality and ourselves, such as love, beauty, and grief. I recently posted something on our Forest Therapy Guides Facebook group about this, saying, and Lachman actually gave me some inspiration on this, because he said, when people use the imaginal, it comes with a great level of responsibility. Because if you construct something that is imaginary, you're not helping people achieve a deeper connection to this reality. You're actually helping them escape this reality. And so the imaginary is like a fantasy. And we know that there's, you may have all had an experience like this. When something is imaginary, we are in control of the fantasy. When something happens that is imaginal, we are not in control. So for those of you that have had an experience on a forest therapy walk where a tree or the sky or the water says something to you, and you didn't control what it said, right? You weren't saying, I want the water to speak to me and I want it to say this. it's as if it just erupts into consciousness. That is imaginal. When we don't anticipate what's going to come through the imagination, it is as if some part of our consciousness is connecting to the world and it's creating the sensation of relationship, but we're not fabricating it, right? And the imaginal allows participants to see their inner landscape as well as to connect to their outer landscape with greater ease. This includes the perception of receiving and also the possibility of giving that creates reciprocity in relationship. And I should try not to get lost in talking all about Gary Lachman's book because I think it's fabulous. But it's really interesting that in the Western esoteric tradition, so many people have relied on the imaginal to reach deeper levels of connection to themselves and to the world around them. And that includes people like Pascal and Einstein and, you know, these big scientists that we think about. This is not exclusive to mysticism. It is inclusive of so many ways of, you know, experimenting and perceiving reality. I think about that moment that they talk about Isaac Newton sitting under the tree and the apple falls and it awakens in him this idea. He didn't control that. It's like the world gave him this gift. All he had to do was slow down and sit under a tree to allow that experience to be cultivated. So a few examples of receiving overheard on forest therapy walks, and maybe you have heard others. Receiving messages from the more than human world. I think this is probably one of the more common ones, that even without telling people to listen, once we get people into liminality, messages just tend to come through. I think it's like when you relax the mental state, it becomes open and receptive, and people can receive these messages from the more than human world. Receiving messages from ancestors. This is an interesting one for me because I have some questions about how this works. Part of it for me is this idea that when we die, we return to the earth, whether that's our bodies are buried in it or we're cremated and released into the sky. Our physical, our bodies are always embedded or enmeshed in this physical reality. So perhaps there is something about that connection to the physical world that allows us to receive messages from people that have passed. Emotional responses, joy, grief, and wonder, a deep sense of rest, and also a feeling of liberation, which I think is kind of, for me, one of the most satisfying things about forest therapy, that when we achieve this sense of liminality, we are free of ourselves and of our culture for a limited time. And just that feeling of liberation has an intense value to it. And then a few examples of giving. I think this is one of the things that it's hard sometimes for people to understand reciprocity in the context of forest therapy, because they'll say, well, what are you really giving back? You're not watering the trees, you're not, pruning the bushes. And of course, like for me, I do pick up a lot of trash in the forest, and I really make an effort to, show some appreciation and some love and gratitude through that. But I think we also should not overlook the fact that our emotional responses can be thought of as gifts to the world, because it is in service to our connection. So a few examples of giving. I recently did a walk where I was doing an invitation with trees, and someone said they found a tree that was broken, and they felt like they were going to sit with it because they wanted to support that tree. They wanted to be with that tree. I thought that was kind of beautiful. I notice a lot of people coming back to circle with promises and wishes and praise for the more than human world. I think that's a gift, you know? Likewise, having grief or tears, having gratitude and love, these things are all gifts to the world. I think sometimes people want to construct these ideas as being only about the individual, but all of this is about relationship. And you can't have relationship without it being a connection between the participant and the world. So these things are not just for the participant. I think these things actually do influence the field of our relationships. Right, and I say these things are not inconsequential. This is the currency of relationship. If the point of forest therapy is to build relationship, these are what we might expect to see when those relationships emerge. Thinking about the mirror. Now this is a little different than the mirror sense that we teach. Once in liminality, participants may notice a lot more than they normally do. Some of what they notice may be something they've never encountered before, while others may be something they're seeing for the millionth time in a new way. Sometimes what people notice becomes like a psychological mirror, and they see themselves reflected in the more than human world. Like music, this mirroring speaks our native language. We intuitively understand it. Oh, hold on, I need to plug in my computer. Ah! Okay. So I find this happens completely organically. We don't need to engineer a situation where people will experience this. When inside of a liminal container, the world becomes highly symbolic. And when we're slowed down enough and we're not thinking, you know, because if, let's say you take someone on a naturalist walk and you're going to point out and explain all the names of species and the properties they carry, people aren't going to see those things as a mirror of themselves, because all of that information kind of separates us from what this relationship could be. When we're not thinking about what it is and explaining it all, small things can become very symbolic in such a way that they become this psychological mirror just reflexively. I had an experience with this on my walk yesterday where there's this one tree in the forest that is one of my favorite trees, and it's been dead for a very long time, but it's standing. And I was sitting with it, and I saw that within it there were these like corpses of spiders. And I had this like this mirror thing where I saw within myself that there's also death happening inside of me at a cellular level. You know, that my body is constantly dying and it's holding death, and also it's holding the potential for that final moment. And that was a really powerful experience for me, just seeing myself in the tree and the tree in me. And I think this kind of psychological phenomenon helps us arrive at more of an understanding of what interbeing and reciprocity can mean. I also like that it's this thing like music, you know, that the forest speaks this language that everyone understands. From a Jungian perspective, you know, they would say, well, the earth is the source of all archetypes. You know, when we think about the archetype of king is really rooted in the apex predator of the forest, or the mightiest tree, the big tree, you know, and the archetype of, you know, the flow could be found in the water, or the archetype of release could be found in the autumn. Like all of the human stories and motifs that we develop our mythologies around are all derived from phenomena in the natural world. So some examples of the way I've seen people experience this psychological mirror. I've seen people say that they're seeing the change. They're seeing the individuality or the uniqueness of themselves mirrored back in the forest. The vitality of the forest mirrored in themselves. The tenderness, the suffering, the humility, the conflict, the release, the tension, the depth, impermanence, beauty, interdependence, freedom, power, and rest. This is just probably a very small list of all the things that people perceive in this psychological mirror, that when they stop thinking about, what's the name of that tree? Or how did this rock get here? When they stop trying to explain it all away, they start to see themselves in the space. So in this way, forest therapy represents itself through an archetypal language of signs and symbols. Participants may interpret these signs differently, but when in liminality, they can all learn how to read it in a way that suits them. When they see the commonality of experience, they begin to form deeper relationships with the more than human world, and perhaps move even towards a deeper sense of interbeing. So then the final one that I wanted to talk about was the intuitive. And I'm still exploring this one a little bit, but one thing that I've noticed about liminality and about the quality of liminality in forest therapy is that people don't know what to do because we're not telling them what to do. This is why for me, I mean, some of you may have noticed this in my posts on our Facebook group. I really feel like it's advantageous to cultivate disorientation and confusion in the participants, to not give them invitations that make it easy. I think having this sense of disorientation actually buttresses the entire process of liminality and individuation. So drawing from the idea that in liminality one does not know from up here what to do, a new sort of knowing arises from the body, one that drives participants towards actions that are not predetermined by the mind and are instead experimental by their very nature. I think this is one of the most fascinating things for me about forest therapy. Like, this encapsulates also that idea of body radar, that your body knows where it wants to go. And when you open that possibility for the body to guide you, somehow it can take you to this very specific thing. I did a walk 2 days ago where we were doing kind of like a treasure hunt type invitation. And one participant came back with this teensy tiny little feather, like a tiny little down feather. And it was underneath leaves. And she was kind of like, I don't know how I found this. My body took me to this place, and then I started digging around in the leaves, and then this tiny white feather was underneath it. And the idea that she could have found that is kind of just amazing to me, but that it's driven by a deep sense of intuition. She didn't know why she went to that place or even why she started digging under the leaves. It didn't make rational sense. But this is one of those things about liminality, that it's not important that it makes sense. So coming back to this thing about individuation, there's an author named Bani Shorter who wrote that individuation can be seen as a movement through liminal space and time, from disorientation to integration. What takes place in the dark phase of liminality is a process of breaking down in the interest of making whole one's meaning, purpose, and sense of relatedness once more. And for me, I'm actually experimenting with perhaps the way we define medicine could also be more simply defined as a sense of wholeness. That the world we live in, the tamed world, is kind of, it's not conducive to cultivating a sense of wholeness because it separates us out from everything else. We have such a strong cultural story about the discreteness and the individualism of our being that we have a hard time being whole because our wholeness is not our own. Our wholeness is connected to all of our relationships. That we can't actually feel a sense of wholeness when we are walled off within ourselves. We can only feel that sense of wholeness when we open up to the potential of being connected to the world. But that sense of connection can be daunting and kind of scary, because thinking about that list from the psychological mirror slide, when we open ourselves up, our wholeness includes things like grief, suffering, death, impermanence. And I think that's so counter to our cultural story. We want to exclude those things from our reality. We tend to push them away instead of opening ourselves to them and welcoming them in. And I think that speaks very clearly to what Shorter is talking about here, that there is a darkness to liminality. There is this dark phase of going into a disorientation about what is and what is not, in the interest of breaking down those stories so that we can reclaim a sense of wholeness. So putting it all together, there are some key ingredients that allow forest therapy to be a potent practice and method. Liminality, created by the thresholding process of the standard sequence and the actions and attention of the guide. The forest as the therapist, connected to participants in liminality through the imaginal, intuitive, and the mirror. And then individuation, understanding that what we're speaking of here is a sense of wholeness and relatedness with the world. This sense arises from the relationship between participant and forest. We don't need to create it. It organically arises. So thinking practically about how can a guide cultivate liminality and let the forest be the therapist? One, building strong thresholds. In many ways, I think people sometimes underestimate how important the introduction, pleasures of presence, and what's in motion actually are. And I should say that sometimes people drop into liminality the second they walk into the forest. You know, some people, when I start my walk, I do my introduction, and then I do kind of a practice round of sharing circle, and I'll say, you know, let's say your name and where you're born and one thing you're noticing about this place. And sometimes people in that sharing circle, just having arrived there, they're already in liminality. One of the walks I do is in the national forest, and it's like way up in the mountains, and it's really different than the city. And so for some people, just driving in their car up into the mountains, that is a threshold for them. They don't even need to go through pleasures of presence and what's in motion to arrive in liminality, but most people do. And they arrive in liminality at different points. Sometimes it's, you know, before we even start, sometimes it's in pleasures of presence, sometimes it's in what's in motion. Some people might not even get there till later in the walk, and that's okay. But building really strong thresholds, helping people get into liminality, and then also on the back end of the walk, helping people go from disorientation to integration. The tea ceremony, really important. It's amazing to me as I continue to do this work that every single piece of the walk has its own importance. They're all important. But sometimes I think people get like kind of really excited about those middle invitations, but those aren't going to be as effective if we don't help people get into liminality. And in some ways, it's a wasted potential if we don't help them incorporate it at the end of the walk. So bearing witness and maintaining omnipartiality, recalling what liminality feels like. There's that sense of a lack of social hierarchy and a not knowing what to do next. This is hard for a lot of guides, I think, because, you know, we all kind of have an unexamined bias, whether we like to or not, that we tend to want people to have these amazing experiences. And I understand that. Like, I get that. I totally feel that. And I've worked really hard on releasing that sense of expectation. Because when you can just really let go, people are going to feel like, oh, like I'm not getting a gold star or an A+ because the guide isn't smiling and nodding all the time because I'm sharing these wonderful things and they're just treating me like everyone else. And that's intentional. We want to do that because it helps that container of liminality remain strong. when we start to preference people's answers over other people's answers, it actually begins to erode that container. Not giving answers. Again, cultivating ambiguity and disorientation is a good thing. I know, that seems weird. Not giving directions, giving truly open invitations, recalling what it felt like to be that child in the woods, not knowing what to do, and you have to pay attention. That's good, we want that. Not judging the process, of course. That really is saying maintaining omnipartiality as well. Working within the imaginal and not the imaginary. I want to do a lot more work with this, training future cohorts, and I'm going to write an awesome chapter about this for the new guide manual, which you'll all be able to purchase if you'd like one. Really helping people connect through the power of the imaginal, but not abstracting them into a romantic vision of imaginary. One of the things Lockman talks about that really resonated with me is that the Romantic period actually did a lot to corrupt the integrity of the imaginal, which I'm going to run out of time if I get started on that, so I'll save that for the next call. Trusting participants to self-regulate and trusting the forest to give what is needed. And I always like to end these presentations about liminality and the magic, if you will, with this Wayne Dyer quote. He said, "You will see it when you believe it." I think this is something that is simply challenging for guides, especially those of you that are just starting. When I train guides, I usually tell them, when we say the forest is the therapist, you're not going to believe me right now because you probably haven't seen it enough times to know that it always is going to happen if you really hold the process with integrity. If you really are trusting the forest and you're really trusting the participants and you're really trusting the process. When you see it happen over and over and over again, it starts to make sense. Something that is irrational and unexplainable and mysterious begins to take on its own logic. I've guided, I think, 163 walks now, and I'm still surprised by it sometimes. It's still kind of amazing that when people get into that liminal state, they find what they need. And it's as if the forest just knows. And what people receive is oftentimes not what they're expecting. One of my favorite reviews of my experience, my forest therapy walk, a woman said, "I didn't get anything I wanted out of this, but somehow I got exactly what I needed." And I just said, yes, that's amazing, you know, because that definitely means that I wasn't catering to her expectation. And I was letting the forest be the therapist. So I have a couple more slides, but they're kind of for a separate presentation. I didn't delete them because I wanted to save them for later in case I wanted them. But I wanted to open up for just a round of comments. We have 5 minutes left on the call, but I'm totally happy to run over to let everyone have a moment to share what they're noticing or what anything they'd like to share, really, whatever speaking from the heart you'd like to share with the group, ideas or questions. I'd like to avoid questions because I think then we'll spiral into many other conversations, but just to create kind of a threshold of incorporation. What are you noticing? And if you need to go, I understand you need to go. So why don't we start with Karina?
Oh, yeah, thank you, Ben. That was so interesting and affirmative. You know, it was very nice to hear everything and a lot of stuff that I didn't know about where this has come from. And it would be nice to have the links to those books. I don't know. That would be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just really warming and reassuring. Thank you. That's what I'm noticing.
and echoing everything you
Absolutely.
said.
Thank you. All right, Alish.
And which one?
Oh, Alish P. That's you.
Hi, Ben. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, it was very inspiring. If I can say that's inspiration. Those three parts you mentioned, because it's something new which really resonates with me. And I agree. The book from was it Thierry Lockman?
Gary, yeah. Here, I'm gonna put it in the chat right now. Here's a link to
Right.
the Amazon if you want to purchase this book.
Yeah. So yeah, and this is never-ending story for me. The liminality states not only for the participants but also for me. So it will be. I think that's till the end of my days. Still something new in that, and I'm looking forward to purchase the new guide manual. If there will be such parts, it will be very interesting for me. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your inspirations.
Thank you. Bente. Bente, you there?
I'm here. Sorry. It was so interesting. I love this. The division between, or the difference between imaginal and imaginary, it was completely new to me. So I'm going to really have to think about it, but I think it solves something for me. So I love that. And yeah, it's like when you talk and I get these flashes. Oh yeah, that's what happened on that walk. And oh, this is what I've been, it's like sort of flashes of, and I just wish I could hold on to them, but they disappear, unfortunately.
That's okay. They'll sink in somewhere in there. They'll come out when they need to.
Loved seeing you all. Really, really. Oh.
All right. Christina, I know you're not going to talk, but if you'd like to, oh, and there she is. She says, this has been a great summary and confirmation of what I've been feeling on my walks. I just led 2 walks for the first time, one combined with yoga and one combined with dogs. I was not worried about how either would go because I knew I could trust the forest. Even so, I'm amazed and grateful each time it happens. Thank you, Christina. Filippo.
Well, I think this was for me like an immersion, not in the forest, but in this community. So that was really great for me. I think this is an excellent example of continuing our training through this meeting that we have on the computer. Is more difficult maybe to connect with the screen in front of us with respect being in nature. But anyway, there are a lot of things that are coming to us and that we have to re-elaborate when we will be outside in different contexts. So thank you for your time as well. Yes.
Yes. Thank you for coming. All right, Giovanna.
Thank you very much. It's really helpful, and yeah, it's a different way to experience everything. And I would say that it's making me a lot of sense when you say trust, something that's like an arrow to the heart for me right now. So thank you very much, and good to see all of you and meet you all.
And Laura.
Yeah, really it's just so brilliant because I feel like supported, because then I'm like, oh, there's other people talking in this way, and it feels so valuable to know how valuable it is that this is it's like I feel like it's taken away, then what you're saying, taking away the known and allowing that unknown to be there. And I actually really love what you first said about being a child in the woods, because I don't think I was, but I really love that idea of like, so I don't know, it's strange kind of self-empowerment of going, yeah, I'm here and I'm gonna, what is this like, and how do I relate to this? And I don't know, I just like that. I'm definitely gonna connect with that, because I kind of can get like, oh, you know, it can be a bit fanciful, and people do kind of go to it as fantasy, which I never have. I was walking along yesterday on my walk, and I was like, oh, I've got more time than I thought. Maybe I should do another participant invitation. And then I looked at this tree, and the tree said, oh no, you can give them more time in their invitation. I was like, thanks. Like, it's just like, cool, of course. Like, so yeah, thank you. Really great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and you know, even if you don't grow up in the woods, I think when we're born, we're in a deep sense of liminality. We haven't developed an ego definition yet. So the world is, by its very nature, extremely liminal. We're all born into the world in this way. So even if we're not, you know, running around in the wilderness, we all are attached to that at a really basic level. Yeah. All right, and Laura. Or, oh, I just called on you. Duh, sorry. Lisa.
God, so many things I could say, and my tired brain, I don't know if the words are going to come out. I just love all this stuff. I mean, I've read the handbook several times on this section, and it's kind of the understanding filters down in layers. Like while you're listening to you, Ben, or reading the handbook, then it just seems so powerful. And then I think I do carry it away with me, but I can't describe it to anybody. But then I don't think I have to, do I? So that's good. It's funny, just before we joined the meeting, I did sneak out. I said I'd been really busy, but I snuck out for a quick walk. I needed some air and some green. And this word came into my head of freedom, because I'm trying to publicize my practicum courses, and, you know, trying to come up with words of how to get people on board. And this word of freedom just popped out of nowhere. And then you were talking about the importance of liberation. So that was a wow. I could go on, there was lots more, but I'll stop there. Great to see you all.
Yeah, the freedom is so powerful. It's like just to be in a space where you don't have to please the authority figure. Just you can do what you want to do and just be whoever you want to be for a while. I think that's so powerful for people. Yeah. All right, Saya.
Yeah, actually, that was exactly one thing I wanted to say, that our environment and society gives us so many roles and how we should be, and we are trying to fill our role in this world. So I think we really need this time in a liminality to be anybody or nobody or whatever, and how we can grow from that and find our potential and maybe take it somehow to our everyday life. I think it's also to give some freedom in our lives. And the other thing was that lately I've been talking a lot with people who also think that everything has to be proven by science. And I feel that I'm hitting my head on the wall. And it's so lovely to talk or listen people who see the other reality or whatever it is. Also, it was great.
I want to buy like a big box of Gary Lockman's book, and when I run into those people, I'll just very graciously give them one of these books. Say, I'd love for you to read this book. All right, great. And Veronica.
Yes, thank you very much for this call. It was really amazing to actually put words on liminality. It was I was very curious how this will be, because it's very difficult, obviously, to describe. And as I was listening, I was thinking actually it's like a magic trick for us guides that we don't have to explain. We know it will happen. We know like how this function. And it's actually very reassuring to know that eventually this will happen to our participants and it will make it a wonderful experience. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. It was lovely seeing all of your faces and hearing your voices. And I hope you have a lovely evening. And for those of you in practicum, you'll see it when you believe it. May the forest be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Ben.
Of course, my pleasure.
Bye, everyone. Nice to see you.
Nice to
Nice
see you too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.